The mud under her fingernails was freezing, but the distant sound of the hounds was worse. They were 3 miles back then, 2 tracing the blood from her torn boots. Cora didn't flee her marriage for an adventure. She fled because the bruises on her ribs finally outnumbered the years she had left to live. She thought the harsh northern mountains would kill her before her husband's hunters could. She was wrong. Something much deadlier was already waiting in the snow. The rain tasted like dirt. It plastered Cora's hair to her cheeks in heavy, freezing ropes, blinding her every time the wind changed direction. She clawed her way up the embankment fingers, sinking into the loamy soil, slipping, catching on exposed, rotting roots. Her lungs burned. It was a sharp, acidic fire behind her ribs. Keep moving. She dragged her right leg up over the ridge. Her skirts, once a heavy, practical brown wool, favored by the Lord's household, were now a waterlogged anchor, pulling her back down into the valley. She considered tearing them off, but the cold was already chewing at her exposed wrists and ankles. Without the wool, the mountain air would peel the heat from her bones in an hour. Behind her, echoing through the basin, came the deep, rhythmic baying of the mastiffs, Garrett's dogs. Cora collapsed against the trunk of a massive dead pine. She pressed her face into the rough, decaying bark, struggling to muffle her gasping breaths. She smelled pine resin, wet earth, and the sharp, coppery tang of her own bleeding knuckles. A rational woman would have stayed. A rational woman would have learned to keep her mouth shut, to lower her eyes when Garrett came home smelling of cheap wine and horse sweat. But 2 nights ago, he had taken his heavy silver signet ring and cracked it across her jaw, just for leaving a draft in the corridor. The swelling had gone down, but the bone still clicked sickeningly when she chewed. He had told her casually, while picking meat from his teeth, that she would not survive the winter. He would make sure of it, so she ran. She pushed off the tree. Her legs trembled violently, the muscles seizing from lactic acid and terror. She didn't have a weapon. She had half a loaf of stale bread, wrapped in wax paper, shoved into her bodice, and a stolen hunting knife that was too heavy for her wrist. The baying grew louder. The sound didn't float on the wind. It punched through the trees, heavy and inevitable. There were at least 4 dogs. Behind them would be Garrett's tracker, a cruel man named Renfrew, and half a dozen guards carrying crossbows. She forced herself to walk. The incline grew steeper, the mud transitioning to loose shale and slick granite. Every step required calculated effort. If she broke an ankle here, it was over. She would lie in the rocks until the dogs found her. She knew what Garrett trained his mastiffs to do to runaway serfs. She didn't want to think about what they would do to a runaway wife. The temperature plummeted as she gained altitude. The rain hardened, turning into biting sleet that stung her cheeks like gravel. She was crossing into the jagged peaks of the Black Ridge, a place the villagers strictly avoided. They said the wolves there grew as large as draft horses. They said the woods were cursed. Cora hoped they were. She hoped she would find a monster before Garrett found her. She slipped. Her boot found no purchase on a wet stone, and her knee slammed hard into the granite. A fresh wave of nausea washed over her. She bit her lips so hard she tasted blood tasting the iron, mixing with the icy water on her face. A pathetic, ragged sob tore out of her throat. She hated herself for it. She hated that she was weak, that she was crying in the mud like a child. "Get up," she ordered herself. "Get up or he wins." She grabbed a protruding rock and hauled her weight forward. The sleet was beginning to stick to the ground, laying a thin, treacherous layer of white over the grey rock. Her tracks would be painfully obvious, but the snow might slow the dogs down. It was a miserable, desperate calculation. She kept climbing the cold, slowly turning her terror into a dull, heavy numbness. By nightfall, the blizzard had arrived in full force. Cora couldn't feel her toes. Her hands were stiff, curled into rigid claws inside the pockets of her cloak. The world had shrunk to a radius of 10 feet, a swirling vortex of white snow and black trees. She was navigating by touch, dragging her hand along the frozen rock faces, looking for a cave, an overhang, anything to break the wind. The mastiffs were still out there. They hadn't stopped. Every time she thought she had outpaced them, the wind would shift, carrying the distant hollow sound of their barks. They were tireless. Garrett had likely starved them for a day before releasing them. She stumbled over a hidden root and pitched forward, face first, into the snow. For a long moment, she didn't get up. The snow was shockingly soft. It insulated her from the biting wind. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. The pain in her knee was throbbing a dull, rhythmic ache that synchronized with her heartbeat. If she slept, she wouldn't have to face Garrett. She wouldn't have to feel the silver ring against her bone. A low, vibrating sound broke through her stupor. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't the wind. It was the dogs, but they sounded different. The frantic, bloodthirsty baying had ceased. Instead, a chorus of high-pitched whines echoed up the valley, the sound of confused, terrified animals. Cora forced her head up, brushing the snow from her eyelashes. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that happens when a forest holds its breath. Then she heard the screams. They were human. Faint, muffled by the falling snow, but unmistakable. A man's voice, shrieking in pure, unadulterated agony, cut off abruptly by a wet, crunching snap. Cora pushed herself up, onto her elbows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. The numbness in her limbs vanished, replaced by a sudden electric spike of adrenaline. Garrett's men. Something had found them. She didn't feel relief. She felt a primal, instinctual dread that settled deep in her bowels. Whatever could tear apart a pack of armored hunters and armored mastiffs in the span of 30 seconds was not something she wanted to meet. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the screaming pain in her knee, and forced herself higher up the mountain. She needed to hide. She found a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough to squeeze her shoulders through. She wedged herself inside, pressing her back against the freezing stone. The crevice smelled like old dust and dry leaves. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her wet cloak tight around her trembling body, and waited. An hour passed. The cold seeped through the rock, sinking into her spine. She began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering so hard they ached. Then she smelled it. It wasn't the wet dog smell of the mastiffs. It was a heavy, intoxicating musk. Pine needles crushed underfoot, damp earth ozone, and fresh, hot blood. It smelled like raw power. A shadow detached itself from the blizzard outside her crevice. Cora stopped breathing. It was massive. Too large to be a wolf, too broad to be a bear. It stood on 4 legs, its shoulders easily reaching the height of a grown man's chest. Thick, coarse fur, the color of midnight, and frost absorbed the pale light of the moon filtering through the snow. The beast lowered its massive head, sniffing the ground. The sound of its inhalation was like a bellows drawing in air. It was tracking her. It had finished with Garrett's men, and now it was following the scent of her fear. Cora squeezed her eyes shut. She pressed her hand over her mouth, stifling a whimper. She prayed to whatever gods listened to dying women in the snow that it would pass by, that her scent would be masked by the ice. The heavy padding of paws stopped directly in front of the fissure. A hot, humid breath washed over Cora's face, carrying the metallic stench of fresh gore. She opened her eyes. A massive eye glowing with a luminescent, predatory amber light was staring directly at her through the narrow gap in the rocks. Cora didn't scream. Her vocal cords, seized, frozen by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. The beast didn't snarl. It didn't snap its jaws. It simply stared at her, its amber eye unblinking, assessing her with an intelligence that was deeply, horrifyingly unanimal. A low subsonic rumble vibrated in its massive chest, shaking the loose pebbles around Cora's boots. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a warning. "I see you." Slowly the creature pulled its head back from the crevice. Cora heard the heavy crunch of its paws moving away. She let out a ragged gasp, her forehead dropping to her knees. Had it lost interest? Was she too small a meal? Her relief lasted exactly 3 seconds. The sound of boots crunching on the snow drifted up the path. Human boots. "I see tracks!" A rough voice shouted over the wind. "She went up the rocks. The mud-blooded bitch is hiding." It was Renfrew, Garrett's chief tracker. He had survived whatever happened in the valley. Cora's blood ran cold. She fumbled for the heavy hunting knife in her bodice, her numb fingers slipping on the leather hilt. She couldn't fight Renfrew. He was twice her size and carried a steel short sword. If he found her here, pinned in the rocks, he would drag her back by the hair. "Come out, Lady Cora." Renfrew's voice was closer now, dripping with malicious amusement. "The Lord wants his property back. You make me climb up there in this cold. I'll break your other leg before we tie you to the horse." She saw the flicker of his torchlight, casting long, dancing shadows across the snow. He was directly outside the crevice. "Found the little rat hole," Renfrew muttered. The torchlight blinded her. She saw his silhouette blocking the entrance, a massive, broad-shouldered shape. He reached a thick-gloved hand into the gap, grasping blindly for her cloak. Cora struck. She drove the hunting knife blindly toward his arm. The blade caught the thick leather of his gauntlet and glanced off, barely scratching him. Renfrew laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Feisty, Lord Garrett will beat that out of you by tomorrow." He lunged forward, grabbing a handful of her wet hair. Pain exploded across her scalp as he yanked her violently toward the opening. Cora screamed, dropping the knife, clawing uselessly at his wrist. Then the torchlight vanished. A shadow eclipsed the moon. Renfrew's grip on her hair went slack. Cora fell backward against the rock, gasping. She scrambled back as far as the crevice would allow, wiping the freezing slush from her eyes. Outside, a nightmare unfolded. The massive black wolf had returned. It didn't attack like a dog, biting and tearing. It attacked like a localized natural disaster. The beast slammed into Renfrew with the force of a falling boulder. The tracker didn't even have time to scream. The impact sounded like a dropped melon. The wolf's jaws, easily the size of a bear trap, clamped over Renfrew's upper torso. Steel armor crunched and folded like wet paper. Hot, bright blood sprayed across the white snow, hitting the stones just inches from Cora's boots. The smell of it was cloying, nauseatingly sweet against the cold air. The beast shook its head once, violently. A wet tear, a sickening snap of a cervical spine, and Renfrew's lifeless body was tossed over the ridge, disappearing into the dark abyss below. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The massive wolf stood amidst the blood-stained snow, its chest heaving steam, rising from its thick coat into the freezing air. It spat a piece of torn leather from its maw. Cora pressed herself against the stone, clamping both hands over her mouth to keep her whimpers trapped inside. She was violently shaking. She couldn't look away from the gore painting the rocks. She was going to vomit. Her stomach heaved, but she forced the bile down, terrified that the sound would draw the monster's attention. The wolf turned slowly. It stepped closer to the crevice, ignoring the discarded torch, sizzling in the snow. As it approached, the most impossible thing happened. The heavy cracking sound of bone shifting and realigning filled the air. The beast's massive form began to shudder, shrinking, condensing. Coarse black fur receded into pale, scarred skin. The elongated snout flattened. Within moments, the wolf was gone. In its place stood a man. He was towering, built with the thick, heavy muscle of a seasoned brawler. He was completely naked to the freezing wind, but the cold didn't seem to touch him. His skin was radiating heat, steaming in the storm. Long, matted black hair fell past his shoulders, and severe, angular features were set in a mask of violent indifference. He was smeared in Renfrew's blood across his chest, his jaw, his hands. He crouched down in front of the crevice, completely blocking her exit. Cora stared at him, her mind fracturing. The myth of the Black Ridge wolves wasn't a myth. They weren't just large animals. They were shifters. Monsters. The man tilted his head, his eyes still that terrifying, predatory amber locking onto hers. He didn't look at her with pity or lust or kindness. He looked at her the way a landowner looks at a stray dog on his property. You smell like sickness and iron. His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp, rough from disuse, or perhaps from the transition of vocal cords. He didn't speak with a high-born accent. It was blunt and guttural. Cora couldn't form words. She just shivered, clutching her torn cloak. "Who sent you onto my mountain?" he demanded, shifting his weight. No one." She finally choked out her voice, cracking. I ran." He studied her face. He saw the swelling on her jaw from Garrett's ring. He saw the exhausted, hollow terror in her eyes. His nostrils flared, taking in a slow breath. "You led hunters into my territory," he stated flatly. "You brought filth to my border." "I didn't know," she whispered, tears finally spilling over, freezing halfway down her cheeks. "Please, just kill me quickly." She meant it. She was too tired to run anymore. The cold was unbearable. If this monster was going to tear her throat out like he did Renfrew, she just wanted it to be fast. She let her head fall back against the rock and closed her eyes, waiting for the jaws. A long beat of silence passed. Only the howling wind filled the space between them. Then, a large, impossibly hot hand grabbed her by the shoulder. Not gently, but without the bone-crushing force he had used on the tracker. "I don't kill weak things," the man grunted, hauling her roughly out of the crevice and into the snow. "But you'll freeze to death in 10 minutes if you stay here." Before Cora could process his words, her legs gave out entirely. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. The world tilted sideways, the white snow fading to a rapid swallowing black. The last thing she felt was being hoisted effortlessly over a massive, burning hot shoulder, smelling the heavy scent of pine and fresh blood. She woke to fire, not the consuming, screaming fire of a burning keep, but a dry, oppressive heat baking the moisture from her skin. Cora gasped, her lungs expanding against something incredibly heavy. She didn't open her eyes immediately. Experience had taught her that waking up was usually the beginning of a new punishment. If she kept her eyes closed, she could pretend she was still in the void. But the smells forced her awake. Wood smoke sharp and resinous, sizzling animal fat. And beneath that, the heavy, musky scent of the predator that had pulled her from the rocks. She cracked her eyes open. The ceiling was low, composed of jagged, soot-stained granite. She was lying on a raised slab of stone, buried under a mound of thick firs. They smelled of dried blood and dust, but they were bone-dry and radiating warmth. Her wet, ruined woolen dress was gone. She was wearing a rough, oversized linen tunic that scraped against her bruised shoulders. Panic flared, cold and sharp, piercing through the heat of the firs. She threw the pelts back, scrambling toward the edge of the stone slab. "If you stand on that leg, the kneecap will slip again." The voice came from the shadows near the fire. It was the same gravel-heavy grate from the mountain pass. Cora froze. The man, the wolf, the monster, was sitting on a carved wooden block, feeding thick branches of dead pine into a massive hearth. In the firelight, he looked less like a myth and more like a brutal reality. He was clothed now, wearing dark, cured leather trousers and a thick woolen shirt left open at the throat. The fire painted harsh orange shadows across his jaw and the thick knotted scars that tracked up his neck. He didn't look at her. He used a long iron dagger to turn a piece of meat roasting on a spit. The fat dripped hissing violently as it hit the white-hot coals. Cora looked down at her right knee. It was bound tightly in strips of clean boiled linen, smelling sharply of crushed herbs and alcohol. Her ankle was wrapped too. Her knuckles had been scrubbed clean of the freezing mud and smeared with a thick, greasy salve. "You stripped me," she whispered. Her voice was a ragged croak, her throat raw from the blizzard. He finally turned his head. The amber eyes caught the firelight, glowing with a disturbing, predatory luminescence. "You were in wet wool in sub-zero winds. I stripped you or I buried you. I chose the former. Don't make me regret the effort." Cora swallowed hard. She pulled the furs back up to her chin, her fingers white-knuckled. She waited for the demand. Men like Garrett never did a kindness without extracting a heavy toll. He had bathed her wounds, clothed her, heated her. Now came the price. "What do you want from me?" she asked. She kept her tone flat. If she was going to be raped or eaten, crying wouldn't stop it. It had never stopped Garrett. The man let out a short, breathy sound. It wasn't a laugh. It was dismissal. He slid the meat off the iron spit onto a wooden trencher and stood up. He was terrifyingly tall, his shoulders blocking out the firelight as he walked toward her. Cora flinched, pressing her spine against the cold granite wall behind the slab. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away, bracing for the blow or the heavy weight of his hands. Something clattered onto the stone next to her hip. "Eat," he said. She opened her eyes. The wooden trencher sat beside her, holding a massive steaming chunk of venison and a cracked clay mug filled with water. She looked from the meat to him. He was already walking away, returning to his seat by the fire. He pulled a whetstone from his pocket and began running it along the edge of his dagger. Shk, shk. The sound was rhythmic metallic and completely indifferent to her panic. "My name is Gilbert," he said, not looking up from the blade. "This is my territory. You stay in this cavern until the bone in your knee sets. If you try to run down the mountain before the snow clears, you will freeze. If the cold doesn't kill you, my perimeter guards will." He paused, running his thumb over the freshly sharpened steel. "And if you bring more of those armed insects to my border, I won't kill them. I'll let them take you back." Cora stared at him. The sheer, pragmatic cruelty of the statement was a bucket of ice water. He didn't care about her. He hadn't saved her out of nobility or lust. He had saved her because she was dying on his front step, and he was offended by the men who chased her. She looked at the venison. The smell of it was suddenly intoxicating. Her stomach cramped so violently she doubled over with a sharp gasp. She abandoned her fear. She abandoned her dignity. Cora grabbed the meat with her bare, trembling hands. It was hot enough to burn her fingertips, but she didn't care. She tore into it, chewing frantically, the rich, gamey juices coating her dry mouth. "Shk, shk." "Slower," Gilbert grunted. Cora ignored him, taking another massive bite. 3 seconds later, her starved, shrunken stomach rebelled. She gagged, leaning over the edge of the stone slab, and dry-heaved violently onto the dirt floor. Gilbert sighed. It was the sound of a man dealing with a lame horse. He walked over, grabbed a smaller knife, and cleanly sliced a thin, manageable sliver of the meat. He handed it to her. "Chew it until it's water," he ordered, "or you'll spend the next 3 days vomiting." Cora took the sliver. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She put it in her mouth and chewed, her eyes fixed on his boots. He didn't touch her. He didn't strike her for making a mess. He just walked back to the fire and threw another log onto the coals. 3 days passed in a haze of localized pain and relentless heat. The cavern was a massive part of a natural fissure deep inside the Black Ridge. It wasn't a mere animal den. There were iron brackets driven into the stone holding fat-burning torches. There were barrels of salted fish, stacked cords of dry wood and heavy iron cooking pots. It was a fortress. Gilbert came and went. He never spoke more than was strictly necessary. When he returned, he brought the smell of the freezing outside world with him, ozone-crushed pine needles, and occasionally the copper tang of fresh blood. Cora watched him. She studied him the way a prisoner studies the guard schedules. She was looking for the trigger. Every man had a trigger. With Garrett, it was a perceived slight, a meal served too cold a word spoken too loudly. She waited for Gilbert to snap. She waited for him to demand she clean his boots or mend his leathers or warm his bed. He didn't. He ignored her for the most part. He changed the bandages on her knee with brusque mechanical efficiency. His hands were impossibly large, his skin always burning hot, a constant reminder of the beast beneath the surface. When he touched her, she held her breath, her muscles locking rigid until he stepped away. On the 4th evening, the blizzard outside broke, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Cora was sitting up on the slab, picking at a bowl of root stew. Gilbert was at the far end of the cavern, stripping the pelt from a large, snow-white hare. The wet tearing sound of the skin pulling away from the muscle echoed off the rock walls. "Your jaw," Gilbert spoke suddenly. He didn't look up from his work. "The bone is misaligned." Cora froze her wooden spoon midway to her mouth. She reached up instinctively, her fingers brushing the hard, unnatural lump along her left jawline, where Garrett's signet ring had fractured the bone. The purple and yellow bruising had faded to a sickly green, but the structural damage was permanent. "It healed wrong," she said. Her voice was quiet, defensive. "It was broken by a blunt object." Gilbert noted tossing the ruined hair pelt onto a pile in the corner. He wiped his bloody hands on a rag. "Not a fall, a strike." Cora looked down into her stew. The broth was murky and brown. "Yes." Gilbert walked toward the fire, pulling up his wooden block. He sat down the flames, casting long, flickering shadows across his broad chest. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The men who were tracking you. The one I killed." Gilbert said, his amber eyes locking onto hers. They were his. It wasn't a question, but Cora nodded anyway. "My husband's." Gilbert let out a low, vibrating rumble from his chest. It sounded dangerously close to the growl she had heard in the mountain pass. "A human lord beats his mate until her bones snap, then sends dogs to hunt her when she flees." He tilted his head, his expression a mix of disgust and dark amusement. "And humans call my kind animals." Cora's grip tightened on the wooden bowl. A sudden irrational flare of anger cut through her perpetual terror. "You tore a man in half." She snapped the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Cora's heart slammed against her ribs. She stopped breathing. Fool. She was a fool. She had survived Garrett by learning to keep her mouth shut, and now she was talking back to a monster who could crush her skull with one hand. She braced herself, waiting for the backhand, waiting for the roar. Gilbert just watched her. His face remained an unreadable mask of scarred angles. "I did," he agreed evenly. "He crossed my border with weapons and hounds. He brought violence into my territory. I met it with superior violence. That is the law of the Blackridge. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at her jaw. But I do not break the bones of the females in my den. I do not hunt the weak for sport. He stood up, towering over the fire. Your human lord is a coward. If he stepped foot in these mountains, I wouldn't bother shifting to kill him. I'd drown him in the river with my bare hands. Cora stared at him. She expected to feel fear at the casual mention of murder, but instead, a strange, hollow sensation bloomed in her chest. No one had ever spoken of Garrett that way. The village priest had told her to pray for patience. The guards had looked away. The other servants had whispered behind her back. This brutal, bloody shifter was the first creature in her life to simply state that Garrett deserved to die. He has a private army, Cora whispered almost to herself. Flesh tears. Gilbert replied bluntly, turning his back to her to bank the fire. Steel rusts. It makes no difference to me. He didn't offer her comfort. He didn't promise to protect her forever. But as Cora lay back down against the rough furs, the cavern felt slightly less like a cage, and slightly more like a shield. By the end of the week, the swelling in Cora's knee had subsided enough for her to put weight on it. She fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy piece of firewood and began pacing the length of the cavern. The inactivity was driving her mad. She felt like a tethered goat waiting for the butcher. She needed to understand her surroundings. She needed an escape route. The cavern entrance was a wide, jagged archway that opened onto a high mountain plateau. When Cora finally hobbled to the threshold, the sheer scale of the Blackridge stole her breath. Endless peaks of black stone and white ice stretched to the horizon, piercing the grey sky like the teeth of a dead god. The air was brutally thin and crisp, burning her lungs with every inhalation. Below the plateau, nestled in a steep, forested valley, was a settlement. It wasn't a village like she knew. There were no thatched roofs or cobblestone streets. It was a collection of massive log structures, built heavy and low to the ground to withstand the wind. Smoke curled from dozens of chimneys. She wasn't just in a monster's lair. She was looking at an entire civilization of them. Suddenly the wind shifted, carrying a sound up the mountain that made Cora's blood run cold to the marrow. Shouts, angry, violent male shouts, the sound of heavy bodies slamming against wood, the distinct, terrifying crack of a fist hitting a jaw. Cora stumbled backward, her crutch slipping on the icy stone. She hit the ground hard, jarring her bad knee, but she didn't feel the pain. She was back in the courtyard of Garrett's keep. She was hearing the guards fighting over dice, waiting for the loser to come inside and take his anger out on the nearest servant. Hide! Her instincts screamed. Hide before they see you! She scrambled away from the entrance, dragging her bad leg, retreating deep into the darkest corner of the cavern, behind a stack of empty barrels. She curled herself into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around her head, squeezing her eyes shut. She tried to make herself as small as possible, as invisible as the dust. The shouting grew louder. Boot steps crunched heavily on the stone outside the cavern entrance. There were two of them. He crossed the river. Gilbert, a new voice, roared. It was younger, rash, and trembling with rage. The Southern Pack thinks we're weak because you haven't skinned their scouts. The river is frozen, Kyle. It's a natural crossing for the elk herds. Gilbert's voice rumbled dangerously calm. They were tracking food, not challenging the border. They are pushing our lines. Kyle shouted the sound of his boots stomping on the rock. If you won't enforce the boundary, I will... A sudden, explosive sound of movement followed. Flesh hitting stone, a breathless choke. Cora whimpered, clamping a hand over her own mouth. The smell of dust and old wood in the corner was suffocating. She expected the younger man to draw a blade. She expected the cavern to fill with blood. "You will enforce nothing." Gilbert's voice dropped an octave, resonating with that terrifying subsonic vibration. It was the voice of the wolf. "You do not dictate the blood spilled on my mountain. Do you understand me, Kael?" A long, tense silence dragged on. "I understand, Alpha," the younger man finally choked out. It sounded as though he was being held by the throat. "Get out!" Footsteps retreated rapidly. Cora remained perfectly still. Her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. Gilbert was angry. He was fueled by adrenaline and violence. In Garrett's house, this was the most dangerous time. This was when she would be dragged from her hiding spot to serve as the outlet. She heard Gilbert's heavy footsteps moving deeper into the cavern. He stopped near the fire. He was breathing hard. "You can come out from behind the barrels," Gilbert said. His voice was flat. Cora squeezed her eyes shut tighter, holding her breath. Maybe he was guessing. Maybe he couldn't actually see her in the dark. "I can hear your heart rate from 30 paces. Gilbert sighed. The heavy crunch of his boots approached her corner. "Come out." "You're sitting in the damp." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her muscles were locked in a paralytic state of terror. Gilbert stepped around the barrels. He looked down at her. She was pressed into the corner, shaking violently, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at his boots. He didn't yell. He didn't reach down and drag her up by her arm. He simply lowered himself, crouching down so his massive frame wasn't looming over her. "He is gone," Gilbert said. Cora swallowed her throat, clicking dryly. "I heard fighting." "You heard an idiot pup challenging his alpha," Gilbert corrected. He rested his forearms on his knees. "It is how the pack functions. It is loud. It is not pretty. But it is over." Cora finally looked up at his face. He wasn't flushed with rage. His eyes weren't wild. He looked tired. When the men shouted, "At home," Cora whispered, her voice fracturing. She hated herself for explaining it, for showing him the deep, pathetic wounds of her mind. It meant someone was going to get hurt. Usually me. Gilbert stared at her for a long time. The amber of his eyes seemed to darken, studying the sheer, ingrained panic written into every line of her posture. He was looking at a creature that had been hunted its entire life, long before she ran into the snow. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out his hand. He didn't touch her. He just placed his large, scarred palm on the stone floor, an inch away from her knee palm up. An offering of space, not a demand. "I told you the first night," Gilbert said softly, the harsh grating of his voice smoothing into something low and solid. "I do not strike the females in my den. I do not need to beat you to prove I am strong. Only weak men do that." He pointed a finger toward the cavern entrance. "Out there the mountain is cruel. The park is brutal. But in here," he tapped the stone floor with his knuckles, "in here there is no screaming. In here you do not need to hide in the dirt." Cora stared at his hand. The skin was rough, calloused, and marred by white, jagged scars. It was the hand of a killer. It was the hand that had snapped a man's neck with a flick of the wrist. And yet as she looked at it, resting calmly on the cold stone, it was the first thing in years that hadn't looked like a weapon. She didn't take his hand. She wasn't ready for that. But slowly, her shoulders unknotted. The violent shaking in her hands subsided. She uncurled her legs, dragging her crude crutch toward her. Gilbert didn't push. He stood up smoothly, turning his back on her to give her the privacy to stand. "Dinner is cold," he muttered, walking back toward the hearth. "I'll heat the broth." Cora leaned heavily on her crutch, pulling herself upright. She watched his broad back as he stirred the iron pot. For the first time since she fled into the blizzard, the ice surrounding her heart cracked just a fraction. She wasn't free, and she wasn't safe. She was living with a monster, but as the smell of wood smoke and hot broth filled the cavern, replacing the smell of fear, Cora realized that perhaps not all monsters were the enemy. The thaw did not arrive with the gentle warmth of spring. It came with the violent, chaotic sound of shifting ice and roaring water. For 3 weeks, the mountain wept. Massive sheets of grey slush slid off the granite peaks, crashing into the valleys with the force of artillery fire. The air in the cavern changed. The dry, sterile bite of winter was replaced by the heavy, humid smell of wet dirt, rotting pine needles, and resurrected moss. Cora's crutch was gone, relegated to the woodpile. She walked with a permanent, heavy limp, her right leg dragging slightly, when the dampness made the misaligned bone throb. She had mapped every inch of the cavern, learning the dips in the floor, the drafts that slipped through the cracks, and the precise moment the afternoon sun hit the western wall. She also learned the rhythms of the pack, though she never ventured down into their settlement. They were loud, brutal, and relentlessly physical. They communicated in shout shoves and the heavy thud of bodies tackling each other in the snowmelt. Yet there was a strange, undeniable order to it. She never heard the sharp, high-pitched scream of a woman in terror. She never saw a child flinch when a grown man walked past. Gilbert remained her only real point of contact. He was a creature of immense, suffocating gravity. He didn't hover, and he didn't coddle. He expected her to keep the fire stoked to salt the meat he brought back, and to stay out of his way when he was shedding the violent adrenaline of a border patrol. It was a domesticity built on survival, entirely devoid of the suffocating performative obedience she had owed Garrett. One evening Gilbert returned just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the cavern in bruising shades of purple and black. He didn't bring fresh game. He brought a heavy steel-banded crossbow. He threw it onto the dirt floor. It landed with a loud final clatter. Cora paused her hands, covered in the flour she was kneading for flatbread. The crossbow bore a sigil carved into the dark wood of the stock, a rampant boar over a crossed sword. Garrett's crest. The air in her lungs turned to ice. The dough in her hands suddenly felt like wet clay. My border guards found 3 of them, mapping the eastern ridge, Gilbert said. He walked to the water basin, plunging his hands into the icy water. They were coated to the wrists in drying, dark blood. He scrubbed them violently. They were equipped with climbing spikes, heavy rations, and enough silver-tipped quarrels to drop a dozen of my people. Cora stared at the weapon. He's coming. The words tasted like ash. All this time, a quiet, desperate part of her had hoped Garrett would consider her dead, that the blizzard had wiped her from his ledger. He is already here, Gilbert corrected, shaking the water from his hands. He grabbed a linen towel. He has an encampment at the base of the foothills. 200 men. Mercenaries, mostly. Rough men with empty pockets and a taste for arson. Cora wiped her flour-coated hands on her tunic. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She looked at the cavern entrance, the dark sky suddenly feeling like an encroaching cage. 200, she repeated, her voice hollowing out. He brought an army for one woman. Gilbert let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. He tossed the damp towel onto a barrel and stepped closer to the fire, the flames casting deep, harsh shadows across the thick scars on his chest. Do not flatter his devotion, Cora, Gilbert grunted. He kicked the crossbow with the toe of his boot. He didn't spend a fortune hiring southern swordsmen because he misses his wife. Cora frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. Then why? Because of the rock you're standing on, Gilbert said flatly. The Black Ridge is sitting on the largest untapped vein of silver in the Northern Territories. For centuries, humans haven't dared to mine it, because my kind lives here. We slaughter their prospectors. We burn their camps." He crouched down, picking up the crossbow and running a calloused thumb over the metal firing mechanism. "Your husband is a greedy, ambitious little man. He needs a reason to march a private army into sovereign territory without the king in the capital stringing him up for starting an unsanctioned war. A runaway wife stolen by the monsters of the mountain that is a righteous cause, that is a crusade." Gilbert looked up at her, his amber eyes piercing through the dim light. "You aren't a prize, Cora. You're a justification." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The breath rushed out of her in a jagged exhale. She wasn't loved, she knew that. But to realize her suffering, her escape, her sheer bloody terror, was nothing more than a convenient excuse for a mining expedition. It made her feel violently, profoundly sick. She was a pawn. She had always been a pawn. "Then give me back," Cora whispered. The words fell out of her mouth before she could weigh them. Her hands began to shake. She dug her fingernails into her palms to ground herself. "If he wants the mountain, take away his excuse. Send me down. Tell him you found me dead. Tell him you killed me. I don't care." She looked at the blood still smeared under Gilbert's fingernails. "You cannot fight 200 men with silver weapons. They will butcher your pack." Gilbert didn't move. He remained crouched, perfectly still, his eyes locked on her face. The silence in the cavern stretched, growing so dense it felt hard to breathe. When he finally stood, the sheer, imposing height of him seemed to swallow the firelight. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Cora's instincts screamed at her to step back, to cower, but she held her ground, her chin tipped up, forcing herself to meet his stare. He didn't strike her. He reached out and grabbed her chin. His grip was firm, his skin radiating that relentless, unnatural heat, but his fingers didn't dig into her bruises. He just held her face steady. "Listen to me." He rumbled his voice, dropping into the subsonic register that vibrated against her collarbones. "If I hand you over, he will kill you slowly to make an example, and then he will march up my mountain anyway. He wants the silver. You just gave him a timeline." He let go of her chin, his hand dropping to his side. "But more importantly," Gilbert said, his tone sharpening into something rigid and absolute, "I am the Alpha of the Black Ridge. I do not pay tolls to human lords, and I do not throw what is mine to the dogs." Cora's breath hitched. "Mine." The word wasn't spoken like Garrett used it. Garrett said "mine" like he was talking about a prized hunting hound or a gold coin. Gilbert said it like he was defining the borders of his territory, like she was a piece of the mountain itself. "They will kill your people," she repeated, her voice cracking. "They can try." Gilbert turned away, walking back to the weapons rack in the corner of the cavern. "The thaw makes the mud thick. Heavy armor sinks. Crossbow strings snap in the damp. We know the high ground." He pulled a massive, double-bladed battle-axe from the rack. The steel gleamed dull and lethal in the firelight. "Rest, Cora," he ordered, his back to her. "Tomorrow the mountain eats." The attack came just after dawn. It didn't begin with a roar, but with a smell. The sharp, acrid stench of pitch and burning pine needles drifted up from the valley. Cora woke to the sound of Kyle's screaming orders down on the plateau. She scrambled off the stone slab, throwing her heavy woolen cloak over her shoulders. She grabbed her crude wooden crutch and hobbled to the cavern entrance. The valley below was a nightmare of smoke and violence. Garrett's men hadn't bothered to climb the main paths. They were setting fire to the tree line, trying to smoke the pack out of the heavy timber and into the open rock where their crossbows would have a clear line of sight. Arrows thick and heavy with silver tips rained upward into the settlement. Gilbert was already gone. He hadn't bothered to wake her. "Get back inside," Kyle barked, sprinting past the cavern entrance. He was stripped to the waist, his skin slick with sweat and rain, a jagged iron sword gripped in his fist. "The Alpha ordered you to stay in the dark." "Where is he?" Cora shouted over the din of clashing steel echoing up from the lower ridges. Ripping their front line apart, Kyle snarled a feral, terrifying grin stretching across his face. His eyes were bleeding into a luminescent amber. He was on the verge of shifting. "Stay inside. If the mercenaries breach the plateau, they'll slaughter you." He didn't wait for her answer, launching himself over the rocky lip of the plateau and disappearing into the smoke. Cora retreated into the cavern, her chest heaving. She felt entirely useless. The sounds of slaughter grew louder, the wet crunch of bone, the shrieks of dying horses, the deep guttural roars of massive wolves tearing through armor. The smoke began to drift into the cavern, stinging her eyes and coating the back of her throat in ash. She coughed, wrapping a damp rag around her mouth. She paced the length of the floor, her bad leg dragging heavily. "Hide!" the old voice in her head whispered. "Find a dark corner. Make yourself small." But as she looked at the dark corners of Gilbert's cavern, she didn't want to hide. She was tired of shrinking. She was tired of surviving by becoming invisible. A shadow eclipsed the light at the cavern entrance. Cora froze. She expected to see Kyle returning, or perhaps Gilbert. Instead, a man stepped through the stone archway. He was wearing heavy plate armor over a crimson tunic. A thick, fur-lined cloak hung from his broad shoulders. In his right hand, he held a long sword. The steel was unblemished, gleaming brightly. The metal crossguard caught the firelight. He pulled off his heavy steel helmet, dropping it onto the stone floor. His dark hair was slicked to his forehead with sweat. His face was sharp, handsome, in a cruel, aristocratic way, marred only by the tight, furious set of his jaw. It was Garrett. He had bypassed the main fighting. While his men died in the mud to distract the pack, he had taken a quiet path up the rear of the mountain, straight to the Alpha's den. He looked around the cavern, his nose wrinkling in disgust at the smell of drying herbs and animal fat. Then his eyes locked onto her. "Look at you," Garrett sneered. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, smooth, entitled, and dripping with contempt. "Living in a filthy hole with beasts. I suppose you finally found a place that suits your breeding, Cora." Cora couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs felt like solid ice. Her grip on her wooden crutch tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Garrett," she croaked. "I lost 30 men on the lower ridge," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step into the cavern. The heavy clank of his armored boots echoed off the stone. 30 expensive men. Because my wife decided to play the whore for a pack of wild dogs. He raised his sword, pointing the silver-edged tip at her chest. "You are going to walk out of here with me." Garrett commanded his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "You are going to tell my captain that the wolves kidnapped you, and when we get back to the keep, I am going to lock you in the root cellar until you forget what the sky looks like." He took another step. He was 10 feet away. Cora's heart was beating so fast it blurred into a single continuous roar in her ears. Her legs wanted to buckle. Her mind screamed at her to drop the crutch, to fall to her knees, to beg. It was the only way to minimize the pain. If she submitted, he would hit her, but he might not kill her. She looked at his hands. She looked at the heavy silver signet ring on his left index finger, the ring that had shattered her jaw. Then she looked at the heavy iron fire poker, resting against the stones near the hearth, just 2 feet to her right. Garrett saw her eyes shift. He smiled, an ugly, knowing thing. "Don't be stupid, Cora. You don't have the stomach for it. You never did." He lunged forward, his heavy, gauntleted hand reaching for her hair. Cora didn't shrink back. The terror in her chest didn't evaporate, but it violently transmuted. It turned into a sudden, blinding, white-hot rage. She was done. She was so entirely done with men putting their hands on her. She swung her heavy wooden crutch with everything she had. It wasn't a graceful strike. It was desperate and wild. The thick wood slammed into the side of Garrett's knee, the unarmored joint between his greaves and his thigh plates. Garrett let out a sharp cry of surprise and pain, his leg buckling slightly. He swung his sword blindly in retaliation. The flat of the blade caught Cora across the ribs. The impact threw her backward. She hit the stone floor hard, all the air rushing out of her lungs in a pained gasp. Her vision spotted black. "You stupid bitch!" Garrett roared, recovering his balance. He stalked toward her, raising the hilt of his sword to bring it down on her skull. "I'll break every bone in your—" Cora didn't wait. She grabbed the first thing her hand found in the dirt. It was the heavy iron skillet she used for roasting meat. It was cold, coated in grease, and weighed 10 pounds. As Garrett leaned over her, she swung the skillet upward with both hands, driving it directly into his face. The heavy iron connected with the bridge of his nose with a sickening wet crunch. Garrett shrieked, dropping his sword as his hands flew to his shattered face. Blood erupted from between his fingers, pouring down his chin and staining his crimson tunic. He staggered backward, completely blinded by the pain. Cora scrambled away, her chest heaving, her ribs screaming in agony. She dragged herself toward the hearth, her fingers wrapping around the handle of the iron fire poker. She pulled herself up to her knees. Garrett was bellowing a wild, panicked sound. He pulled his hands away from his ruined face. His nose was flattened, his eyes swelling shut. He looked around wildly, his boot kicking his dropped sword. "I'll kill you," he screamed, spitting blood onto the cavern floor. He bent down to retrieve his weapon. Before his fingers could graze the hilt, a massive shadow blotted out the light of the cavern entrance. The air pressure in the room shifted. A low, vibrating snarl rolled through the space, so deep it rattled the iron pots on their hooks. Garrett froze. He slowly turned his head. Gilbert stood in the archway. He was in his wolf form, but he looked like something dragged from the depths of hell. He was entirely coated in human blood. It dripped from his jaws, matted his midnight fur, and steamed in the cold air. 2 silver bolts were protruding from his massive shoulder, but he didn't seem to notice them. His glowing amber eyes were locked onto Garrett. Garrett stumbled backward, his bravado entirely evaporating. He scrambled for his sword, but his armored fingers were slick with his own blood. He couldn't grip the leather hilt. "No!" Garrett whimpered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. Wait, I yield. I claim the right of ransom." The massive beast didn't bark. It didn't roar. Gilbert took one slow, deliberate step into the cavern. The crunch of his heavy paws on the stone was the only sound. He looked past Garrett, his eyes finding Cora kneeling by the fire, holding the iron poker, her face bruised, but her eyes burning with defiance. The wolf's gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second. Then it snapped back to the human lord. Gilbert lunged. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The wolf's jaws clamped around Garrett's armored throat. The heavy steel gorget crumpled under the thousands of pounds of bite force. Garrett didn't even have time to scream. The sickening sound of crushing metal and snapping vertebrae echoed loudly. Gilbert shook his massive head, once violently snapping the neck completely. He tossed the limp armored body across the cavern like a discarded rag doll. It hit the far wall with a heavy thud and slid to the floor, leaving a thick smear of blood on the stone. The cavern fell dead silent. Only the crackle of the hearth fire remained. The battle for the Black Ridge ended 2 hours later, with their lord dead and their front line decimated by monsters that shrugged off crossbow bolts. The surviving mercenaries broke rank and fled down the mountain, abandoning their weapons and their dead in the mud. Inside the cavern, the silence was heavy. The smell of cheap wine, human sweat and blood lingered in the air, a foul miasma that made Cora's stomach churn. She sat on her stone slab, staring at the empty space where Garrett's body had been. Kyle had dragged the corpse out an hour ago, tossing it over the ridge for the ravens. There was no funeral pyre for enemies. Her ribs ached with a dull, rhythmic throb where the flat of the sword had struck her, but she wasn't broken. She had survived. More importantly, she had fought back. The heavy iron skillet still sat in the dirt, coated in Garrett's blood. She didn't feel victorious. She just felt deeply, profoundly exhausted. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed in the tunnel. Gilbert entered the cavern. He was back in his human form, wearing only his dark leather trousers. He looked terrible. His skin was ashen slick with cold sweat. His chest heaved with shallow, labored breaths. The 2 silver bolts were still embedded deep in the thick muscle of his left shoulder. Black, necrotic veins were spreading out from the entry wounds, poisoning his blood. He staggered toward the fire, his knees buckling. He caught himself on the heavy wooden block, collapsing heavily onto it with a harsh groan. Cora stood up, ignoring the pain in her ribs. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a clean linen cloth, the small skin of clear alcohol Gilbert used for cleaning wounds, and a small, sharp paring knife. She walked over to him. He didn't look up. His eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw clenched in agony as the silver burned him from the inside out. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice steady. Gilbert opened one eye. He looked at the knife in her hand, then up at her face. He didn't argue. He just gave a tight, barely perceptible nod. Cora braced herself. She gripped the shaft of the first bolt. The metal was unnaturally hot, reacting violently with his biology. She pulled. Gilbert let out a deep, chest-rattling snarl, his massive hands gripping the edges of the wooden block so hard the timber splintered. The bolt slid out with a sickening squelch. Black, corrupted blood poured down his chest. She tossed the bloody silver onto the dirt. One more. She gripped the second bolt and tore it free. Gilbert shuddered violently, his head dropping forward. The wounds were ugly. The flesh around the holes was dead, charred black by the silver's touch. It wouldn't heal on its own. It had to be removed. "I have to cut the dead flesh out," Cora said softly, pouring the alcohol over the clean linen. "Or the poison will spread." "Do it!" he gritted out. Cora knelt beside him. Her hands, which had trembled violently when she held the fire poker, were now perfectly steady. She pressed the knife into his shoulder, cutting away the blackened necrotic tissue. He didn't flinch away from her. He trusted her completely with the blade against his skin. When she was finished, she poured the alcohol directly into the raw wounds. Gilbert bit back a roar, his muscles locking rigid. She quickly packed the holes with clean, crushed herbs and bound his shoulder tightly with fresh linen. When she finally tied the knot, she sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on a rag. The fire popped. The storm outside had passed, leaving the mountain bathed in the pale, cold light of late afternoon. "He's dead," Cora said quietly, staring at the bloody rag in her lap. "Yes," Gilbert replied. His voice was rough, exhausted. He was staring at the flames. "His men will tell the king," she continued, her voice devoid of panic, simply stating facts. "They will say the beasts of the Black Ridge murdered a lord. They might send an army next year." "They might," Gilbert agreed. He turned his head, looking down at her. "The passes are clear of snow. The southern roads are open. Kyle found a purse of gold on your husband's body. It is enough to buy passage on a ship out of the northern ports. You could go to the free cities. Disappear." Cora stopped wiping her hands. She looked up at him. He was offering her an exit. No debts, no demands. The monster who had dragged her from the snow was holding the door open for her to walk away. She looked around the cavern. She looked at the soot-stained ceiling, the rough furs, the harsh, unforgiving stone. She thought of the world down below, the human world, a world of polite lords with silver rings and cruel smiles, a world where women were property traded for land and beaten for leaving a draft in the hallway. Then she looked at Gilbert. He was a killer. He was brutal, territorial, and violent. But he had never laid a hand on her in anger. He had taken her pain seriously. He had given her a weapon and expected her to survive. "The winters here are very long," Cora said quietly. Gilbert watched her carefully, his amber eyes unreadable. "They are. The cold kills the weak." Cora tossed the bloody rag into the fire. She watched it burn the flames, devouring the last physical evidence of her fear. She reached out her fingers, gently brushing the edge of the clean bandage on his shoulder. "It's a good thing I have a heavy cloak, then," she said softly. Gilbert didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled, but a profound, heavy tension seemed to bleed out of his massive frame. He reached up his large, burning hot hand, covering hers where it rested near his shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding, and fiercely protective. "Yes," the Alpha King rumbled the sound vibrating in the quiet space between them. "It is. If Cora's transformation from hunted prey to the fierce companion of the Alpha King had your heart pounding, smash that like button and subscribe. We love bringing these gritty, intense, dark romance stories to life. Drop a comment below. Would you have chosen to stay on the brutal mountain or taken the gold and sailed away to the free cities? Your comments keep these stories going. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next epic tale.